Can I start with a story? Once upon a time, there was a young man who had just finished his schooling and was about to set out into the grown-up world to establish a name for himself. However, before he embarked on the road before him, he thought it might be a good idea to seek some advice on what is the best way for him to become rich and successful. And he knew the two perfect people to get advice from. First, he decided to visit his rich uncle, whom he admired and who he had not seen for several years. He called ahead, spoke to his uncle's personal assistant, who set up a 30-minute appointment for 2 weeks later. When the day came, the young man was nervous and excited to see his uncle again, who he hadn't seen for years, and to visit his estate, which, although close, he had never had the opportunity to visit. As he turned off the road into the laneway, he was stopped by two great cast iron gates, which he first had to buzz an intercom to receive clearance before the gate opened. He then drove another mile up the laneway past manicured gardens and parked his rusty old Chevrolet next to a number of sparkling foreign cars. Once he entered the palatial home, he was then taken into an impressive sitting room where he could admire the wealth and achievements of his uncle. Eventually, he was led into his uncle's grand study that looked onto a stunning view of the lake. There, his uncle held up a finger for him to remain silent while he finished an important call behind his large mahogany desk. To the young man's right was a liquor cabinet filled with fine wines, aged Scotch and other spirits. When his uncle finally put down the phone, he smiled, remained behind the desk, offered nothing to his nephew, said some pleasantries about it being too long, and then asked directly his nephew why he sought an audience with him. The young man, knowing that his uncle's time was money, came directly to the point and asked, "Uncle, what is the best way to ensure I become a rich and successful man?" The uncle let out a hearty laugh and said to his nephew, "You have come to the right place. Just take a look around for yourself," as the uncle encouraged his nephew to appreciate the impressive surroundings. He then encouraged his nephew to take out a pen and a paper and write notes, which the young man did frantically, trying to keep up. He jotted down different names of firms, stocks, advisors, markets, investments, portfolios, along with a host of economic terms he would have to Google later to figure out what they meant. Precisely 30 minutes later, the assistant stepped in and reminded the uncle of his 4:30. The uncle got up, gave his nephew a firm handshake, ushered him to the door with no invitation for a return visit. After driving away from his uncle's, the young man longed for the riches and success of his uncle. But then he decided this would be the perfect time to visit the second person he wanted to get advice from. We'll continue the story later. Aw, it's like, I like that. I like you guys leaving hanging. There you go. Well, this week as we've just finished Easter last weekend. Mother's Day is just 2 weeks away. We just finished our midweek kids blast program at both sites, and we thought for these next 2 Sundays we would resurrect something that was a staple here at Trentside for a number of years. I think part of it was from the initiative of Kathy Van Hultren's leadership, which was just called Faith at Home, where at least once or twice a year we would have set aside a Sunday just to encourage moms and dads, grandmas and grandpas, guardians, that the responsibility that you have to instill in the upcoming generation is essential. It is important. And so what we want to do is this week I'm going to look at an Old Testament passage. Next week, Pastor Matt is going to look at a New Testament passage. But again, we want to look at scriptures that encourage the importance in home in developing young lives in the wisdom and the fear and the faith of the Lord Jesus Christ. And as I was thinking about what passage I wanted to look at, there was a number of passages from the Old Testament that initially came to mind. But one of the later passages that I thought of was one that just kept holding on, that I just kept going back to, and I thought, this is the one that I want to pick. And it's the first chapter of the book of Proverbs. So if you got your Bible, follow along with me with the first chapter of Proverbs. And there's 3 main reasons why it was this chapter that I wanted to point our attention to this morning. First of all, the first chapter of Proverbs, probably more than any other place in the Bible, introduces us to the theme and the importance of godly wisdom. A second reason why I thought of Proverbs is when you understand the first chapter of Proverbs, which serves as an introduction, if you understand this first chapter, that will help you unlock and understand the rest of the book, all that follows in this incredible book of wisdom. And third, this first chapter highlights the importance. In fact, it assumes that the essential and primary place for passing along godly wisdom is in the home. Now, probably the best way to think of the first chapter of Proverbs is that it contains two introductions to this great book of wisdom. The first 7 chapters are sort of the general introduction and helps unlock to understand all that happens, right? It gives this broad overview for this idea of godly wisdom. Verse 7, I'm going to say, is the most important verse in the entire book itself. But then when you get to verse 8, it gives you the more personal introduction to this great book of wisdom. And you get to see who it's from and who it is for. The first thing that I want to do is I want to look at these first 7 verses. And I want you to look at, really, it gives us these 6 aspects that are central to this idea of godly wisdom. First of all, I want to look at the first 5 aspects that come from verses 1 to 6, and then specifically carve out verse 7. But even before we do that, it begins this way: the Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel. Now, I just want to pause here for a moment, because oftentimes we read that first verse and we think, okay, we know exactly who this book was written by. It was written by Solomon. And that's partially true, but it's not quite 100% accurate. Solomon is responsible for the majority of the material in this book of Proverbs, but it was probably not Solomon who put it together the way that we have it. Why do I know that? Because in chapter 25, we get this little note, this little side that says, here are more Proverbs of Solomon that were compiled by King Hezekiah. And if you know anything about King Hezekiah was a great, several great time grandson of King Solomon. He was an ancestor of Solomon, and he lived about 200 years after the time of Solomon. And then it also includes wisdom statements and proverbs from other people that it mentions. So likely what we have here, and we are told again in First Kings chapter 4, that Solomon was responsible for collecting over 3,000 parables. So what we have is whoever's got this, he's taken that 3,000 parables or so of Solomon, some of them from Hezekiah. He's compiled them, curated them, limited them, cut some out, left the most important ones that he thinks in, grabbed a few from others, but he's arranged it in such a way, why, as you're going to find out, to be a gift that a father can leave behind to his son. And we get to be the inheritance of this treasure. Well, let's look at these different aspects, and I want to pull out, first of all, the first 5 aspects that come from the first 6 verses. And the first aspect of wisdom is one that is not very popular in our day and age. It says this: wisdom assumes discipline. In fact, it assumes discipline in 2 different ways, but listen to verses 2 and 3. For attaining wisdom and discipline, for understanding words of insight, for acquiring a disciplined and prudent life, doing what is right and just and fair. Right next to this thing, for attaining wisdom and discipline. And it's almost as though discipline is synonymous with this idea of wisdom. And that word that they use for discipline, and kids, you're not going to like this, it actually can be translated correction or rebuke. Okay? Do you get that? You know, kids love those things. It doesn't mean it's harsh. It doesn't mean it's a punishment. It doesn't mean that any time a kid steps out of line, they get a whack. That's not what it's saying. But it is saying this, that if you want to pass along wisdom, part of what is necessary is to provide correction, provide rebuke when people fall out of line. Do you get that? A lot of times people think, because, who are we to judge? Kids, they're smart. They'll just figure it out. Just let kids be kids. Who are we? Or that's what the schools are for. That's what YouTube's for. They can work it all out, right? That's why we have social media. Such smart alternatives. No. Right? Part of being a parent, part of instilling wisdom is just saying, we do this here, we don't do this here. The second idea is, why do we do this? Because wisdom creates what's called a disciplined life. The picture there is literally, the way it's used is like a path, a road. And it's trying to keep that kid from falling off to the right or to the left. And as once they start veering, you say, okay, back on this way. Start veering this way, back this way. So why? So they stay in on the straight and narrow path. Again, the first aspect of true godly wisdom actually includes this idea of correcting wrong behavior, wrong ideas, wrong thinking. The second aspect of wisdom is expressed by behavior. Listen to, again, the way that verse 3 says it. For acquiring a disciplined and prudent life, and then it says this, doing what is right and just and fair. And that's the NIV, and the NIV is not a great translation, but literally the word there where that they translate right, just, and fair is quite literally wise behavior. And I think about it this week, and I think about it in this way in the day and age that we live in, is who do we go for sources of wisdom? One of the things that I find somewhat astounding, especially in our current day and age, our current world, is who are the most influential people, right? When you talk about social media, you'll have influencers and you see the most popular and they've got, millions of people and kids who are following these people along. And again, people are listening, and every day, every time somebody posts something, they go, oh, what did they post? What did they post? People they will never met, they don't know anything about, live in a different world. Right? They're photoshopped everything that they see from this person. But that same person, think if you're a young kid, you may have the luxury of having a grandma and grandpa who've been married faithfully together for 50, 60 years. They've lived a solid life. They're respected by their family. They're respected by their community, by their neighbors, where they've worked. Right? But kids like, they don't know anything. What do they know? But they flock to hear what's the latest from the coolest celebrity. Never mind that person's on their third marriage. Never mind they've been in and out of rehab a dozen times. No matter all these different things, they're cool. They know what they're talking about, but miss what's right in front of them. You want to look for a good source of wisdom? Just look at the people's actions. Look at people's behavior. The third thing, it says this, wisdom must begin early. Verse 4, for giving prudence to the simple, knowledge and discretion to the young. Again, the young is start early. You don't have the luxury to say, later they'll figure it out. We'll instill this later on. No, the earlier you start, the better. That word simple is also the word naive. It assumes like a childlike person, but it also assumes this idea of taking responsibility. If you see someone and their mind is simple, they're not developed in the ways of wisdom, maybe they don't have good examples, and we're to look at them and say, hey, let's come alongside them and encourage them and train them up as well. So again, it begins early. It starts with discipline. It's pay attention to behavior, start it early. And then fourthly, it says this, wisdom listens and seeks for more wisdom. If you're looking for a good starting place for wisdom, look for someone who's made wisdom a priority in their life. One of the most important commands in the book of Proverbs is one single word, listen. Over and over again, the person that's giving it, the father is giving it to his son, just says, listen. listen, listen, right? Think about what James says, that we are to be slow to speak and quick to listen. So if you're listening to someone who loves to share their opinion, loves to share their advice, but hates to hear what other people have to say and doesn't seem very interested in what other people have to do or other different perspectives, that's probably not a very wise source. He says one of the great characteristics of wisdom is people who seek after it, right? If you got it, you want more of it. Again, a little bit later in chapter 2, the beginning of chapter 2, the father says to his son, seek out wisdom like one would seek out silver or a hidden treasure, right? Go on a search for it. Go on, it's a treasure hunt. Now, some people here might be looking and thinking and go, okay, but I did not grow up in a home where there was much wisdom demonstrated. Mom and dad were hardly good examples. What am I supposed to do with my kids and my generation? How do I correct that? And notice what it says. It says two things. First of all, we're to instill that wisdom in the generations that follow. But the second thing is go after it. Look for it. Make it a priority. If it wasn't demonstrated, if you didn't receive it, that doesn't stop you from looking for it and going after it and making it priority now. Maybe it wasn't demonstrated for it. Maybe you know you're not the best example. But then find those godly examples that are close to you. Bring in people who can mentor you, train you, help you out, and be good and godly examples to your kids. Right? Again, don't allow that to be an excuse not to pass that wisdom on to the next generation. And then finally, this last one, and it's the most curious one, is what I'm going to say is wisdom demands brain work. Verse 6, for understanding proverbs and parables, the sayings and riddles of the wise. And again, this is one of those key verses that helps you understand how to understand the book of Proverbs, the rest of the book, and I would say even a lot of understanding what Jesus taught. Remember, Jesus taught by telling parables. And somebody asked him, Jesus, why do you teach in parables? And his answer is so that ever hearing but never listening, seeing but never perceiving, right? He goes, some people aren't going to get it, some people are going to get it, right? Why would they do it this way? In fact, that last word there, sayings and riddles of the wise, that word riddles quite literally means ambiguous statements, hard to understand. Well, where's the wisdom in putting out hard to understand stories and statements and parables and riddles? That doesn't make sense. Why? Because it involves the listener in the process. It makes them internalize it. This is the difference between wisdom literature and legal literature, right? When you have law, it's pretty simple to understand, unless it's written by, a Canadian lawyer or something and they're trying to make it difficult to understand. But generally speaking, it's pretty simple. Thou shalt not murder. Okay, is there any wiggle room? It's, Moses, you're not being very clear. What do you mean by thou shalt not, right? Right, we can either choose or not choose. But when you hear it in a parable, when you hear it in a story, you're like, you've got these pieces, but we got to put them together. How do I understand this? How do I apply it in my life? Why do I keep thinking about it? You think about it over and over again. Which character am I in this statement? Am I the fool or am I the wise man? Am I the simple or the knowledgeable? Am I the wicked or I'm the righteous? Right? We internalize it. And then finally, what I'm going to argue is the most important verse in the entire book of Proverbs, verse 7, and the most important aspect, the starting place of wisdom. Verse 7, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and discipline, right? They hate being corrected. Where does true wisdom start? Where does godly wisdom start? With God, right? That idea of fear of the Lord doesn't mean just kind of hovering in the corner and worrying that if you do anything wrong, God's going to smite you with a lightning bolt. But it's a sense of humility. It's the sense of reverence. It's this idea that this godly wisdom is not something that is natural to us ourselves that we contain, but it is something that is provided to us by an outside source, by our supreme creator, God. Psalm 14 starts this way: the fool says in his heart, there is no God. So again, the wise person starts with God as the foundation, as the starting point. The fool starts with the absence of God. There's this debate that's often goes around in philosophical and theological circles, and it's this idea, can we be good without God? Can a person be a moral person and not believe in God? Now, we would argue that, again, you can be as religious as you want or unreligious as you want, and that doesn't mean that it's going to make one person more moral or immoral than the other person. Of course, people who don't believe in God or don't have any religious sensibilities don't do great and nice and wonderful and noble things. And sometimes those who might be atheistic or have no religious idea or kind of sense at all can be more moral than some of the most faithful churchgoers. What's he saying there? That apart from God, there is no foundation for wisdom, for morality, for right and wrong. They are completely subjective, right? They're subjective to the individual themselves. Just think about the past century, the 20th century. The 20th century was probably the bloodiest, the most violent in all of human history. Most of the violence of tens of millions of people's lives lost and slaughtered were coming from quite openly godless regimes who banished God, banished religion, right? And the people, we kind of look back in horror, but if you ask most of the people at that time, what they thought they were doing was good and noble because it was for a higher cause. Now you might look and say, well, but Pastor Jeff, there's all sorts of violence and terrible things that have been done in the name of religion, even done in the name of Christianity. Absolutely true. But there is one major difference, right? When somebody does something wicked, somebody does something evil, even in the name of God, they ultimately know that they are answerable for what they have done to that higher power, to that supreme being, to their creator. The one who doesn't says they are answerable to no one. The only one they're answerable to is to themselves. So the foundation, the starting place, is the fear of the Lord. The next thing that I want to look at, again, in these next two verses, really go into the general or the personal introduction to this great book. And these are the two verses that really I was thinking about of why I wanted to do it with this faith at home message. Listen to these words, verse 8. Listen, my son, to your father's instruction. Do not forsake your mother's teaching. They will be a garland to grace your head and a chain to adorn your neck. And one of the things that you find in this great book, and you find it especially throughout Scripture, is that it assumes that the place that is responsible for passing on wisdom is the home. And probably the best way to think of the book of Proverbs, again, this book of godly wisdom, is as a love letter, specifically from a parent to their child, as a father to their son. In about 20 plus different places throughout this book, just as you're reading along, all of a sudden you just hear this refrain, my son, my son, my son. Why is that there? So it's this reminder to the reader that this is a gift from a father to his son, from a parent to their child. This father and this probably the mother along with them, they're thinking, what is the greatest gift that we can pass along? Is it this heirloom? Is it this trinket? Is this set of family jewels? And he says, no, it's wisdom. And they took the time, they took all those Proverbs of Solomon and other people, put it in a form and said, here is the greatest treasure as a parent I can give you. Godly wisdom. Take it, right? It's just this precious, precious thing. And I want to say this, and this is if you get one thing out of this message today, this is the most important thing I can get across. The responsibility of passing along wisdom, faith, the fear of the Lord, prudent living, and knowing right from wrong is the responsibility of mom and dad. Let me say that again. The responsibility of passing along wisdom, faith, the fear of the Lord, right and prudent living, knowing right from wrong is the responsibility of mom and dad, AKA it's the home, right? Mom and dad, and we recognize certain homes are broken and different things. If it's not mom and dad, it's aunts and uncles, it's grandmas and grandpas. It's guardians who step in that place, who can fill in that role. The Bible assumes that the best place, the foundation for godly wisdom is not outside the home, it's inside it. One of the things that's common in our world today is that we just live in a world that just tends to want to outsource everything. Who will be responsible for that? If I went home today and there was a flood in my basement, you probably don't want me fixing it. I'm going to probably find someone far more qualified, and I'm going to outsource that work to a qualified plumber, right? There's all sorts of things we can outsource. Tomorrow is election day. I don't know if you guys knew that, but I don't know if you follow any of the campaigns, but one thing politicians are wonderful at is promising the moon, the sun, and everything, right? They will be your butcher, baker, your candlestick maker, whatever you want. They will make sure that they will be provided for you. It's one thing they cannot provide. And often even too is when something doesn't happen, when something goes wrong, it's like, where's the government? Who's responsible for this? The one thing they can't provide is the foundation of faith and wisdom in the home. One thing they can't provide or fix is that foundation of wisdom that is supposed to be established in the home. But some might say, hey, but Pastor Jeff, doesn't the church play that role? Doesn't the church play an important role? Yeah, the church plays an essential role. But the church was not called to raise children, right? Yes, we provide children's programs and Sunday school and youth programs, but that is not a substitute. It's not an outsourcing. It's just a portion of it. In fact, probably the best way the church can support is not just providing, programs and ministries for kids, but of greater importance is to provide the training and the responsibilities of moms and dads and grandmas and grandpas and other guardians, right? Giving them the tools, having wise mentors coming alongside them and helping them in the process. Why? So that they can take on that role and encouragement for themselves. But what about school? Right? Isn't the school there? Well, the school is there to impart knowledge, how to read, write, math, all those different things. But a school isn't the one who's responsible for what they are to do with all the knowledge once they receive it. Schools aren't always neutral, right? It's up for mom and dad to navigate them with that wisdom. Here's what you need to do with that information now that you have it. Here's a scary thought. Think about how much time your kids are at school, how much time they're with their friends, and here's the scariest one of all, how much time they're in front of a screen in a given week. Only a parent has the proximity, has the close relationship to help equalize what they are getting from all these outside various places, right? And none of those outside sources love your kids and have the well-being in your kids like mom and dad have in mind. To raise your family, to raise your kids, your grandkids, it is a sacred, it is a holy calling. Do not outsource it to someone else. See it as holy. Hold on to it. Impart that godly wisdom. Just going to quickly move through the rest of this chapter, mainly just to help us understand the rest of the book of Proverbs. Verses 10 kind of speaks about and following talks about that there's basically two types of paths, right? There's a path that leads to destruction and a path that leads to life. There's two types of people. There's the wise person and the foolish person. Sometimes it's the simple and the knowledgeable. Sometimes it's the wicked and the righteous. But it says this: if you choose the wrong path, if you choose the wrong friends, it can lead to big problems. Verse 10, let me pull out just a couple verses. My son, verse 10, my son, if sinners entice you, do not give in to them. Verse 15, my son, do not go along with them. Do not set foot on their paths. Verse 16, for their feet rush into sin. They are swift to shed blood. Such is the end of who all go after ill-gotten gain. It takes away the lives of those who get it. One of the things as you go through Proverbs, you're going to hear, and if you're familiar with Jesus' most famous sermon, the Sermon on the Mount, you will hear the echoes of Proverbs all the way through Jesus' most famous sermon. It was Jesus who said, broad is the road that leads to destruction and narrow is the path that leads to life and only a few find it. Right, from Matthew 7. That language, that imagery, that idea is taken directly from the book of Proverbs and Proverbs chapter 1. The other thing that you'll find as you go through this book, and it's introduced us, is that wisdom is a life partner. It is to be seen as a marriage partner, as a spouse. Verse 20, it says this: wisdom calls out in the street. She raises her voice in the public squares. At the heads of the noisy street, she cries out. In the gateway of the city, she makes her speech. Wisdom is personified as a woman through the book of Proverbs. And again, it's this idea of receiving her. Now, this interesting, when she's introduced, she's in the public square, she's on the streets, she's speaking loud and clear for all to hear. Now, there's a throng of other voices and competing voices, but one of the reasons why she's able to do it in the open is because with wisdom, there is nothing to be ashamed about. There is nothing to be hidden from it. You can take it or you can ignore it. Whereas counter to wisdom, sin is portrayed also as a woman, an evil seductress who will tempt. And where is she always active? In dark alleys, at nighttime, in seedy places. And she will always bring people to the pit. Does anybody know how the end of Proverbs ends? It's often a passage that you look at Mother's Day. Does anybody know the chapter 31, the final remarks of Proverbs? This is where you want to say Bueller. Anyone? Bueller? Anyone? Does it? Right? It's this kind of poem to the wife of noble character. And if you've ever read this poem to the wife of noble character, especially if you're a wife, you're like, wow, I'll never live up to that. But many people say it's not specific to your human earthly wife, but making wisdom your wife, your partner, right? Which one are you going to receive? And again, it's this idea that wisdom should be a life partner. And finally, just going to bring this out, we're warned that wisdom has an expiry date, a best before date. Let me again read some of the final lines. When calamity overtakes you like a storm, when disaster sweeps over you like a whirlwind, when distress and trouble overwhelms you, then they will call to me, but I will not answer. They will look for me, but not find me, since they hated knowledge and did not choose to fear the Lord. Again, there's that idea of fear the Lord. Since they would not accept my advice and spurned my rebuke. And again, there's that importance of correction. Verse 32, for the waywardness of the simple will kill them, and the complacency of fools will destroy them. And then the final line, for whoever listens to me will live in safety and be at ease without fear of harm. Let me condense that again. See if you sounds familiar to anything else you've heard in the Bible. Verse 27, when calamity overtakes you like a storm, when disaster sweeps over you like a whirlwind, when distress and troubles overwhelm you, And then go down, it says, the complacency of fools will destroy them. But whoever listens to me will live in safety and be at ease without fear of harm. Sound familiar to anything? Think about the parable Jesus ends his most famous sermon on, the Sermon on the Mount, right? Remember the parable? If you don't remember, you probably sung it. You know, the wise man built his house upon the rock, the foolish man built his house upon the sand. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house upon the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against the house, yet it did not fall because it had a foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against the house, and it fell with a great crash. What is the foundation we are building our homes on? It is too precious. It is too sacred. It is too important to outsource it on anything other than the rock of Jesus Christ and the wisdom that comes from his word. Without calling ahead, the young man went straight to the second person he thought to seek advice from, his grandma's place. He pulled into the familiar potholed driveway unannounced. He saw his grandmother was on the porch saying goodbye to one of her neighbors and sending her home with a jar of one of her famous preserves. Upon seeing her grandson, although it had only been a short time, she welcomed him with a bear hug and a wet kiss. Bragged about him to her neighbor before the neighbor began making her way back down the street. She then welcomed him into her house, her old, outdated, and humble home. Never asking, she went directly to the fridge, poured her grandson a tall glass of iced tea, and then opened up a bag of freshly made muffins, which she said she had made them for a certain Jones family who were going through a tough spell, but she didn't think they would mind if she kept one back for her grandson. As they made their way to the living room, Grandma spent the time asking questions about her grandson, treating him as if he were the most important person on the planet. When they finally made their way to their seats, the grandma asked the young man, "So, what do I owe the pleasure of this visit?" The young man then asked the same question he asked his successful uncle an hour earlier. "Grandma, what is the best way to ensure I become a rich and successful man?" Similar to his uncle, the grandma let out a great bellow of a laugh. "If you are seeking advice on riches and success, I think you have come to the wrong place. Just take a look around you." The young man looked around the familiar setting. The carpet stains, the well-worn furniture, the pictures of family and friends crowding the walls, bookshelves, and tabletops, the partially finished greeting cards laid out on the dining room table getting ready to be mailed, the muffin set aside for the Jones in the kitchen, the piano in the corner with Grandma's gospel favorite songbook open wide, the teapot and still dirty cups on the coffee table from a previous guest, his grandma's old worn-out King James Bible beside her reading chair along with her folded prayer list beside it. As he looked around, he was flooded with happy memories and the warmth of this place. Together they talked. The grandmother never tried to answer the question he asked. Together they shared memories, spoke about family, friends, church, the community, and much more. He ended up staying for dinner and even for Wheel of Fortune and Jeopardy. Before making his way to the door. As he was about to leave, his grandmother gave him one final embrace, told him she loved him, that he was welcome anytime, and then with a mischievous gleam in her eyes, she said, "Sorry I couldn't help you with your question about riches and success." As the young man pulled out of the driveway, considering the road set out before him, he thought to himself, maybe I need to rethink the meaning of riches and success. Proverbs 24, 3-4 says this: "By wisdom a house is built, and through understanding it is established. Through knowledge its rooms are filled with rare and beautiful treasures."